Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of the House Committee on Finance here in room 35. Before we get started with our briefing today, the first thing we're going to do is have a roll call by the clerk, please.
Chairman Abney,
Present.
Vice Chair Slater, Vice Chair Malzakowski,
Present.
Representative Moore,
Present.
Representative Baginski,
Present.
Representative Barrows,
Present.
Representative Diaz,
Here.
Representative Edwards,
Here.
Representative Hull, Representative Dadone, Representative O'Brien, Representative Quattrucci, Representative Gero,
Here.
Representative Tobon,
Here.
Representative Wilkinson.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much for that, and thank all of you for being here and making this a quorum. Tonight, what we're going to do is hear from several people. First of all, Sharon's going to give us a briefing on the second quarter report, and we have from the administration Director Warmer, who will give us some color to that report. It's important that all of us begin to get into the rhythm of understanding how complex this is going to be. And tonight will be a lot of numbers, a lot of figures, but we always like to make sure that the public sees what we see and understand the numbers. You hear so many rumors a lot about if you have surpluses or deficits, and people really don't understand what all of that means. And the result of that is that sometimes people think, well, you know, we've got a whole bunch of money, we can do a lot of things. Well, over the next 2 or 3 briefings, we're going to get a dose of reality and be able to figure things out. So after Sharon gives her briefing as usual, especially for people who are new, if you have any questions at all, this is the time to ask, and there's no such thing as a question that's not cool. We all have questions, so if you're new and there's something you don't understand, Sharon will absolutely make sure that we have a base that we're building from. So when we get to the complex stuff, we will be there. So tonight there are no bills that we're hearing, but it's mostly a briefing. And then after she's done, Director Warmer is there to bring up the rear and answer any questions that we may or may not have. So Sharon, if you would take us through it, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of facts and figures tonight. You wouldn't believe I do my best, try not to confuse you too much, but I expect that tonight you may leave with more questions than answers, but I think as the months progress, that will be resolved. The first 2/3 of the fiscal year are now over. This very unusual situation that you're awaiting a governor's budget with the fiscal year almost over, and also that the fiscal year 21 budget became law in December with already half of that year over. That is really unprecedented. So that budget included a lot of experience from the actual conduct of that fiscal year. Typically when we come to you with the first quarter report, we talk to you about how things have changed since you left in June. We spend some time bringing you up to speed on how the agencies are doing. Essentially, by the time you adopted that budget in December, the year was half over. You had a lot of data to go on, and so much of what's new for you tonight or unexpected will come from changes at the federal level, and that more than ever has a great deal of impact on what you're doing. As you know, the 2021 budget allowed the governor to delay budget submission until March 11th. That is coming quickly upon us. So we're here tonight to kind of give you some sense of where we think the state budget status is with the available information we have, including what you adopted in December, the newly released audited closing from fiscal 20, the newly released budget office quarterly report, plus information from earlier second quarter reports from the agencies. Moving parts on federal legislation and related guidance, some of the prior information provided by the Office of Management and Budget on COVID spending, those reports, the transparency portal, and just some of kind of how the staff is interpreting this. these items are going to be subject to frequent change. Over the last several months, we met a number of times and things kept changing. I expect that will be the case as well here. Looking back on the last few months, you can see that at any given time, you're really stuck in 3 fiscal years. You're still not out of fiscal 20 as we look at the closing again. Your current year is fiscal 21. That is the budget that was just adopted and may require some revision before the year is out. And the governor is going to be presenting you with next year's budget, fiscal 22. These are all interconnected, and sometimes we have to look at some of these items across multiple years. Legislative and administrative actions from the federal government have had a significant effect on the budget. In many cases, this has been a positive effect. There has been state budget relief, newly approved grants for COVID response, an enhanced match extension on Medicaid, and a new waiver of the state match on FEMA expenses. We've also learned of some potential costs to the budget in the way of reduced revenues from a change in the tax treatment of certain expenses related to the Paycheck Protection Program. There's some other tax extensions approved after the budget was adopted, and there's some discussion we need to have about maintenance of effort requirements on new federal legislation and programs and things that are continuing to evolve. As we talked about last year, when we talk about budget deficits or surpluses, usually that refers to the year that just ended or the current year, right? So it's the difference between what you actually spent and what you thought you were going to spend or what your current projections are. When we talk about next year, fiscal 22, we usually refer to that as a budget gap, where we try and estimate how much will you need to do the same thing, how much will you have to do that same thing, and is there a gap? Now, the governor is going to have to submit to you a balanced budget and also present some look at the 5-year forecast based on proposals contained in that budget. These have been always a little bit tricky to project and are subject to varying assumptions depending on who's doing it. One thing we talked about last several months was where you start and where you end. For the future year, it's easy. It's sort of like an estimate of, like I said, everything, what you think things are going to cost, and then what you think revenues are going to be. But there could be a lot of subjective assumptions. In the current year, we're looking at what's the budget that was enacted, and what updated spending and revenue estimates do we know about that might need to be incorporated. I would say that the uncertainty that is pervading this discussion complicates every one of these calculations. And you're going to see that is a theme throughout my comments. So I know everybody wants me to tell them a number. Tell me the number. There isn't a number. There are a range of things that could happen and things that you'll need to be prepared for. So I hopefully when this is over, you'll get a sense of why nobody can give you a number and any kind of certainty. We've certainly dropped the idea of having certainty in this environment. The budget that you adopted back in December was based on the current law, everything that was in place at the federal level and the state level. So you could only base it on what you knew to be true. So in the case of certain things like FEMA match or Medicaid, if you didn't know something was going to end favorably for you, you couldn't assume that in the budget. So it was balanced with a small surplus, but the budget gap estimate, I pegged it at about $450 million, mostly at extensive use of one-time funds. So the 21 budget was balanced with driving huge surpluses forward from the availability of CRF funds and other things, including the fact that in 2020 we reached into the rainy day fund to help close a gap that ended up not being as big as feared. So that's where you landed in December. Now, the federal activity has altered this outlook. The fifth stimulus was enacted at the end of December. Administrative action was taken on Medicaid and FEMA match, and as everybody knows, there's a pending sixth stimulus that is a high interest. So let's talk about a couple of things we do know. Back in March, the second stimulus predating the CARES Act is the law that contained this enhanced Medicaid match for the state. 6.2% increase in the Medicaid reimbursement rate continued on a quarterly basis as long as a public health emergency was still in play, and those were renewed every 90 days. So by the time you adopted the budget, all we knew is that this public health emergency was good through 3/4 of 2021. So your budget included only the savings associated with that, $108 million. Sometime after that, end of December, beginning of January, that was extended another 90 days. You pick up another quarter. That's, Budget Office has it pegged at $34.5 million in their quarterly report. We've always said it's roughly $30 to $35 million, so some of that just depends on what the spend is, because this isn't block grant money. This is, you don't get it unless you spend it. So the other development on the Medicaid match front is that the Biden administration gave notice to governors that they do plan to keep renewing the public health emergency through the end of calendar 21. So just as a reminder, your fiscal years are July to June, and that means that calendar 21 is the first half of fiscal 22. So to the extent that the public health emergency ends on or before December 31st, 2021, you get 2 quarters of savings, $60 to $70 million. If it slips one day past that, you get another quarter. So we'll just say, you know, it seems likely that there's at least $60 to $70 million in deficit relief, well, budget gap relief for next year. Combined, the 3 additional quarters over the 2 fiscal years bringing a relief of about $100 million against the budget and projections from when you left in December. So that's kind of a flavor for how things can change and really change quickly. And we'll talk about a little more detail now on the closing and then other things as we go. I'll start with the audited closing and then move into some other current year changes and then look beyond 2022 and some of the major issues you'll be facing. You recall that in September, it was reported that the supplemental budget you adopted the prior June was a little bit too conservative on the revenue and expenditure side, and for you that meant picking up about $180 million to use to balance the 21 budget. During the 6 months after that, you heard that there might be a way to use the CRF money for some expenses that were already incurred in 22, and so we expected there would be significant changes in the closing. In fact, the budget itself was assuming that a lot of that was going to carry forward. The budget for 2021 assumed about $70 million of additional surplus would be rolled over based on this charging of personnel costs to the state coronavirus relief fund, which I will refer to as CRF. That's your $1.25 billion. That's been the semi-flexible money that's really helped you get through this crisis. So at the time, we also mentioned that there may be other significant changes and kind of previewed some of those for you. So if you only look at the audited report, which everyone has a copy of if you're interested, it looks like the surplus is lower, $156 million. We were just talking about 180. What's going on here? That's deceiving, and I'll explain why. Basically, on the expenditure side, you had more expenditures charged to general revenues than expected, and that is all because of an accounting issue with the FEMA money that resolves itself in the current year, so it is not of a consequence to you, but it looks a little funny if you're only looking at 1 year. So let's talk about the major changes in the audit. Almost $110 million of expenditures that were expected to be charged to FEMA, reimbursed by FEMA with a state match, because of some strange way in which revenue can be recognized and general accounting principles. and with great debate, this expense had to be moved to the revenues had to be moved to 21, but because the expenditures were incurred with no federal funds for them technically, general revenues were charged. So ultimately, it looks like general revenues were not budgeted, and that number went up. At the same time, we already knew there was going to be some expenditure reduction from additional charges to the CRF fund. So the net there is only in the $30 million difference on those two items. There was also a favorable adjustment to estimates for what the state was going to have to pay for some Medicaid expenses. You know, whenever they close the books, they make an estimate about what additional expenses related to that year need to be paid, and it turned out some of them with more data, and because this whole thing was delayed, they were able to fine-tune that number and bring it down. By the same token, the continued problems with Eleanor Slater Hospital meant that some funding that was expected to come in from prior year billings was really not expected to come in now, given that it was federal reimbursement for things that the feds no longer reimburse us for, and it was the feeling that this was not something that they could continue to pursue. So that was a negative adjustment. Also, at the time we talked to you about the closing back in October, we told you that the Department of Behavioral Health Care, Developmental Disabilities, and Hospitals had not completed what they called their cost allocation plan, which was a plan to properly charge federal funds, so there was an additional general revenue cost. That's been wiped out here. And so all told, if you look at these changes, this is where you lose $24 million. But it's more important to look at it over 2 years, and that is the technical accounting for that reimbursement, as I told you, really just gets reversed in 21. So it's a net change of nothing over 2 years. There was additional CRF personnel charges that we hadn't expected, and there was funding available for. That's $7 million. And then all those other items I just described net to about 8.7. So there's actually a pickup here across the 2 years. So that's a favorable adjustment from this closing, even though it's a little bit confusing getting there. I think the bottom line is that across 2 years, when all is said and done, there's actually more money available than you thought there would be. Not very much more, but a little bit more. We had noted back in the fall some issues, again, still on federal match across a couple divisions in Buda. One got resolved, as I said, the cost allocation plan. One is still out there, a smaller issue, less than $1 million, but that continues to be an issue. So that brings us to 2021. The Budget Office issued their second quarter report, which you should have a copy of, and I also emailed one to you when we set up the hearing, suggesting that the current year is looking at about a $44 million surplus, most of which comes from the extension of that Medicaid match I just described to you. They also have some minor adjustments, not very extensive, around some programs in DCYF, and then a further deterioration of expectation of federal funds at Eleanor Slater Hospital. There wasn't a ton of federal funds booked in your final budget, and this takes, looks like about a third of that away. At the time the quarterly report was submitted, it was due on the 15th and was submitted on that date. The audited closing was not complete. Now, you typically have the audited closing right around the new year. It's been very reliable. However, with the massive flow of federal funds in and out of the state, multiple changes to all of the accounting rules around that, the folks doing that work needed more time to do it properly, and therefore the audited closing was later than usual. So it's not showing up in the Budget Office quarterly report. So if we look at the quarterly report, you can see their bottom line of $43.7 million, improving by about $32 million. If you get the audited closing pickup, you're closer to $50 million in being ahead. So audited closing plus Budget Office quarterly report, a fairly nice cushion in the current year. Doesn't approach the hundreds of millions of dollars in out year expected budget gap, but you're ahead. So now we're going to turn to some of the impacts of the federal actions to talk about what's going to change these numbers even more. We're now up to 5 federal acts to address the crisis. They're listed here, and we did, all the members were emailed a link to our updated report on federal programs that affect the state. I had the staff bring down copies of that for you. We have not updated that since the end of June, so it contains information on the latest report as well as updated allocations because these things change frequently depending on guidance, and it does take a while once a bill is passed for the guidance and to figure out what the state might get, what its entities within the state might get. So this is a moving target, but here's an update for you. As you remember, these acts include funding for state and local budgets. As you know, many of them have strings and limitations, but also the direct stimulus payments, some tax changes were allowed in the CARES Act. And then on the business side, there were the PPP loans and some other optional tax changes. Looking at the money flowing into the state, excluding some of those individual items and excluding the couple billion in unemployment benefits, these acts have produced over $3.3 billion for the state and its agencies and entities and providers. That's our recent estimate. We get a lot of those estimates through a service, the Federal Funds Information for the state, and we've outlined those for you in this memo if you're interested in sort of where some of those came from. And again, these things continue to move. But for some context, when we last talked about this in May, the bottom line number on this table was about $1.9 billion. So there's a lot of new money flowing to the state. The most recent one, the Consolidated Appropriations Act for 2021, 5,600 pages of legislation, contained a couple of what they call divisions that are related to what they identified as COVID relief at about $900 billion, but then it also had like a federal budget attached to it. So there were a lot of moves in there that are affecting state agencies, affect the state's bottom line. We have not cornered the market on figuring out all of those impacts. We have started to. I know state agencies are looking at how this affects them. We've brought you some highlights today, but I expect that this is one of the many things that will evolve. And these are bills that have passed. So one of the biggest components of this new act is for our education support. It's mostly distributed the way the CARES Act provided funding to both higher ed and lower ed. And it does have requirements for states to maintain spending, something we refer to as maintenance of effort, but they're different. Last time around, you had to pick a number, and you had to look at your average spending and make sure you didn't go below that. Now there's some language around proportion of spending compared to the rest of the state budget. That gets tricky because it's influenced by your other choices. And so this is going to be complicated to offer you some guidance on. We looked at some numbers where it might require you to spend more money to give this out. So we're still looking at that. The funding itself is available into fiscal 23. And it is significantly higher than what was provided through the CARES Act, as we kind of show in this table here. CARES Act had about $85 million for institutions and government in the state. The Consolidated Appropriations Act is about $250 million. You can say, one area that's of high interest to most members is the K-12 funding. Most of you remember the distribution on the $46 million back in June before you adopted the supplemental. You can see that number is 4 times that now. And so again, the guidance on this is not complete, and there's some more information to be had out there about how this is going to work. But it's going to be interesting to implement and see how it affects the rest of your decisions. Notably, the CARES Act, as well as this new act, provided the governor a flexible fund different than the higher ed and the lower ed fund. Across both acts, it totals almost $20 million. Back in January, Governor Raimondo submitted her plan for both the CARES and the new funding. We've summarized this for you here. You can see that according to the law, some of this has to go to private schools, and that is listed there. The rest of the funding is being allocated for expansion of access to programs at CCRI, similar to the way Promise works, expanding pre-kindergarten, providing some funding for student access to mental health, and then a number of things for the Office of Post-Secondary Commissioner to try and work through. To my knowledge, most of these are just getting underway and maybe an area you want to look into as well. Centers for Disease Control grants, about almost $9 billion in the federal act, with Rhode Island getting about $71 million of that at our last check, 61 for testing and about $10 million for vaccine preparedness. You may recall that in your 21 budget, you had to provide $73 million of general revenues to the Department of Health to supplement known federal sources because your CRF money was running out and was going to expire. So there were a lot of moves in that budget to make sure you freed up enough money to carry on the work post 12/30. And now I think, one area that everyone's looking at is how much of this new funding can be used to offset some or all of the general revenues that you've provided, because now there are federal funds specifically for that purpose. To the extent you're able to do that in any meaningful way, that funding is freed up to help solve your next year's budget deficit. Transportation, another issue of high interest. In the Consolidated Appropriations Act, there were two big things that happened. In the regular budget, DOT was provided an additional $60 million, subject to its same 20% match. But then the stimulus portion provided over $50 million for highway projects to cover things like operating expenses and revenue losses with no state match. This is, you've all heard from the department and here in this room about how match becomes an issue if the state is able to get federal funds. Often it is scrambling to get the match in order to meet that. So there's a huge portion of this that is not requiring match and should provide some breathing room for transportation. As you know, it's struggling with some gas tax collection declines and other revenue issues, which partially caused you to put that ballot item out there in addition to some other things. But match is an issue as they get more federal funds. This does not come with that problem and, in fact, helps solve it a little bit. The other big thing, as I alluded to earlier, is the Act extended the opportunity to use any leftover CRF funds for another year. Now, again, when you adopted your budget in 2021, you assumed this was over. You did not have a federal law in place to extend it, and most of the funds appeared to be committed to be spent by that previous deadline. As we talked about in this room many times, there are a lot of unknowns about some of those commitments, and to the extent they weren't all used, the state would have the opportunity to repurpose them for an eligible use for a 9-month period following that deadline. So, for example, if the state found that it had, the deadline came and went and they were left with another $50 million, there were other eligible uses they could go back and pay for, including, for example, putting the money in the unemployment trust fund. So that was always an option. There was no plan to give any money back. The state now has another year to figure out if all that money is spent, and it also opens up an opportunity to help relieve some general revenue expenses if that's the desired direction. You had pretty much exhausted those options in the 21 budget. You now would have another year to try and use that way if that's a piece of the funding you'd want to use. We have looked at this, and I don't suggest to have all the answers, and I know these are moving targets. The information we're seeing does suggest there is some left having to do with the program uptake, as well as I mentioned, the FEMA is now saying that the states do not have, the Biden administration has instructed FEMA to waive that match. So we came in here in May talking about you might have to pay general revenues for the match, then you found out you could pay CRF match. Now there's no match. So that means that $100 million of FEMA money that was spent in 2020 no longer requires $25 or $30 million of match from either CRF or general revenues, which frees up CRF. Now again, you could use that to offset state funds, or people might think there's other uses related to the pandemic. There's the general revenues budgeted in health for costs because you thought you were running out of CRF. So there are a lot of decisions to be made around this money, including if people want to look at additional relief programs. As we told you over the past several months, the guidance from Treasury on the use of this money evolved over time, sometimes conflicted with itself, and ultimately the guidance that the budget was based on is compliant with the last updates and did allow you to achieve some general revenue savings on the personnel side in particular. We've summarized here for you what we think that amounted to over the 2-year period, to almost $275 million. And so that both gave you additional surplus as needed, but also just immediate relief in the current year. It's important to know, though, that all of these dollars spent from CRF are not there next year. And so as you're using this money to bridge the gap to an economic recovery, this is one-time money. And that will be the case with any other additional money, likely. There is probably not going to be any ongoing support for states that span several years that you can make long-term commitments with. It's really, there to help you get over some of the tough months. Looking at the whole $1.25 billion, we took another stab at figuring out from all of the documents available to us what we think was committed for which purpose. And why do I say we took a stab at it? Because there's so many integrated programs. There is no list of here's how we're using the CRF for the reasons I explained about FEMA match. And then also maybe some things could be paid for with FEMA, maybe they couldn't, so there were estimates. The administration has tried to keep us updated on their best estimates of these, both costs and then splits on how it can be paid for, but it's a moving target, and it's not always clear what the final numbers are going to be. But I've summarized that here for you. It does look like there may be small tens of millions that hasn't been allocated. It's not entirely sure if that FEMA is in there or not, so it's a little bit, we're still working through that, as I'm sure the administration is as well. There are still many, many bills to be paid under this program. You have the transparency portal, which gets updated roughly monthly to give you a sense of the spending. It's from all of the pots of money available, by the way, not just this. So there is no one place where you can just find out how much CRF has been spent. But if you look at that, there's a big lag in some of the actual bills being paid against amounts budgeted. One I've kind of just kept an eye on because it seemed like a big lag has to do with the testing. And when I ask, I'm told that there is a pretty long lag time for those billings, and then sometimes it involves insurance billing. So you may find in a couple of months that these numbers are very different. Some things are known. We already know what the state paid out when it committed to surge to enhanced unemployment benefits for the 3-week pause. That's a known thing. Other things less known. The hospital and nursing home programs, those are known. That money's been paid. But other areas, it's more commitments, waiting for bills, trying to see exactly what some of these costs are. So these numbers will move around. When you adopted the 21 budget, as I mentioned, you budgeted about $100 million of state money, thinking the CRF money wasn't going to be there, and it fully committed to other things. This is how it worked out in terms of general revenues and federal funds. So this is where, again, you may have an opportunity to free up some of these general revenues because you have additional federal funds available, less match requirement, other things happening. So this is another opportunity to revisit some of the spending estimates. And of course, these numbers continue to change. And so we've provided one of the more recent estimates we got at the end of January from the Office of Management and Budget on what they think the numbers are. So there's a little bit of even general revenue savings there. That's not really in any of the other estimates. One thing that's on there that you didn't see in the budget, and I'll talk about in a little bit, is a $10 million commitment to providers of those with intellectual and developmental disabilities to help stabilize that system. That was that deal was reached after you adopted the budget. That would be incorporated into a revised budget, but that commitment was made as part of working with the federal court on the consent decree. So many of those items may now be covered by new or freed up federal funds. As I mentioned, FEMA match, leftover CRF, state funds could be substituted for new grants that were made available. It's hard to, it would be very easy for me to double count all these numbers. You have this CRF, you can add to that. So the intersection of all of these and the expenses are not 100% clear. And it's likely why you didn't see a big savings in the quarterly report from the new Department of Health grants. I think people are still sorting through the guidance to see what can be swapped for what's the best use of the funding. And then the other issue becomes which one requires match, which one lasts longer. You know, there's a timing issue that has to happen to make sure the state is maximizing its use of all available resources and trying to make sure that some of these costs and their effects are smoothed out over a longer period of time. So looking at the budget gap estimate we produced for the budget at its enactment, around $450 million, 440. If you pick up maybe $25 million on the closing, and then another 30 in the quarterly report, and then you have the next year's enhanced Medicaid match, you've knocked over $100 million off of that number. Maybe more, maybe less. Again, these are, but you're still in the couple hundreds of millions of dollars. So where will that come from? Revenue and caseload estimates will be estimated again in May. The economic forecast and recovery will change those estimates. We are seeing where the current sales tax data is very strong versus the estimate, tens of millions, not hundreds of millions, but an area that has remained strong, likely a big result of the federal stimulus and keeping people getting paid. The other revenue performance, it's harder to draw conclusions from. The economic conditions have changed taxpayer behavior on both business and personal income. And then again, the major change on the PPP loans, it's very hard to draw conclusions right now on some of the early data. I suspect we will also be quite confused in May, but hopefully have enough to go on to make a better estimate. And just as a reminder, repeating some slides from the last revenue estimate, you can see that the 2022 estimate is less money than was estimated for 2021 and less than was collected in 2020. So improvement in the revenues is not, that the economy is taking off. Some of it's a function of we weren't really sure where the bottom was, and so these revenue levels are not spectacular and have room to improve, but they were depressed, and some of what's being talked about in future stimulus is help for states on revenue replacement. And we have struggled with making these estimates. I'll leave you to look at this slide on your own. I've showed you before about how they've bounced around, and as more information became available, what do we think it is? And so that's really an issue that could help the budget, but you could see that those numbers slide more. There are other factors in taxpayer behavior that we may not be aware of yet that we'll start to see as the months go on. There are other issues and risks to all of these numbers, as you wonder, is 300 million-ish the right number? Eleanor Slater Hospital, the current issues there, we've spent a lot of time on those, where the state spending was forced to fill in where federal funds used to be. There's continued uncertainty on the plans for even limited federal funds. In your quarterly report, as I mentioned, there's a decline in expectation of those federal funds. Those were based on approval of what we call a state plan amendment to the Medicaid program that's still pending and has been for several months. Just as a recap, the services being provided don't match eligibility for that level of service. So the state is unable to bill a hospital level of care if a patient is not eligible for a hospital level of care. That has been the issue you've been struggling with for a year. And as a reminder, prior funding levels for the hospital, federal funding levels were $60-ish million. You're now down to a fraction of that. And again, that's further deteriorated. So that is a long-term issue for your budget consideration as well. Going back to the issue of the federal consent decree regarding services, community-based services and work opportunities for individuals with developmental disabilities, that is an issue that you'll probably see something in the governor's budget on, and some continued work on stabilizing that system. There's a few years left on the consent decree, and the state has some work to do to meet the standards of that. So I would consider that a place where we haven't accounted for a potential cost. Obviously, there's a high level of uncertainty on a whole bunch of items, including a potential new stimulus. As we've seen in all of these, the federal legislation can really affect state revenues while offering taxpayer relief. So in the example of some income tax changes that were done in the CARES Act, the state had to recognize millions in losses, which benefited state taxpayers but also lowered state revenues. So the federal government can give with the stimulus, and it can also take away from a state budget perspective. And many of these programs come with, as we say, strings and limitations. Maintenance of effort being one I've talked a little about tonight, but there can be others. And at the end of the day, most of this support is expected to be one time. And so as you look to solving a budget for this year, you really need to look over a multi-year horizon and think about planning and stability. If your revenues and your expenditures are volatile, you're going to have a hard time delivering the same level of services each year. You get to think about how you can smooth that over and consider one-time uses for some of the one-time funds to the extent possible. The big picture on what your budget looks like, what it used to look like, we'll call the 2020 original enacted some kind of baseline because you made so many changes in the revised and in the 21. You can see that from all sources of funds, it was almost $10 billion. The big increase to $12.7 billion, really on the assistance and grant side, mostly unemployment benefits, and then passing through a lot of that federal money that came, as well as direct spending on items like building hospitals, providing direct relief to the pandemic. From a state funds perspective, this is where you can see some of the areas that benefited most from the available federal funds. Your expenditures from assistance, grants, and benefits, which is where a lot of the Medicaid payments flow through, are actually lower in this budget from general revenues than the last budget. And that is one of the major effects of having that enhanced Medicaid match. Remember, that was worth over $100 million. Will continue to be worth a little something, hopefully for at least one more budget. as well as local aid. There was some swapping that happened there, reductions on the state side and appropriate use of federal funds on the other side to keep people whole, but ultimately those funds need to be replaced. So that's kind of a little picture. On the salaries and benefits, you can see very clearly that reduction from the original enacted to the 21 is almost all the money that you were able to use federal funds for. So those are not generally going to be there. Maybe they come again, but they won't be in the future. So that becomes your big challenge, is how to navigate this not over 1 year, but over a several-year period, given what's coming down from the federal government, which again, we're really not sure of. Most people have heard about the potential for state and local aid at very large amounts. And we've learned that sometimes the detail of that can really alter the ability to use that in a way you may want to think about using it. I have read some of the items that some of the state and local programs are expected to be able to be used for revenue replacement, something that you didn't get in the CARES Act, and that certainly both the state and cities and towns would like the opportunity to have that flexibility. But there are also a lot of tax changes in there. I've read some tax changes that will again impact the state's revenues, so there'll be some give and take on that, and it will definitely take some time to sort through all of these impacts. So that is my not very clarifying presentation, but to give you a sense of the scope of what's before you for the next few months. Happy to try and answer any of your questions.
Well, thank you for clarifying everything for us, Sharon. That was really, really good. No, I feel you in the sense that I think it was important that the public and new members of the committee and some of us who've been around for a while really understand the complexities that went into putting the last budget together, but even the complexities that's going to be for putting this budget together. It is not as simple as having a number. I've just got a couple of questions just to clarify based upon what you gave us. Would it be fair to say that the use of much of the funds that we get from the federal government is restricted in some sense, that we can't just do anything we want to with the funds that we get in terms of trying to balance our own budget? Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say that you have both practical, you have legal restrictions, and then you have some practical restrictions. So on the one hand, as you went through with the CRF money, you had some really tight guidance to navigate in order to try and have some flexibility with that funding to deal with some budget problems. Many of these programs come with those kind of strings. Sometimes it calls for new spending to make sure you're not substituting funding. And then I would say you have some practical restrictions. And just to the extent that this money is limited, that going and making annual commitments with one-time money is just practically a limitation, I would say. I don't think the federal government will say you can't use my $10 to go give someone a $10 raise annually. They'll just not be there for the next year when the bill comes due.
Yeah. And I think too, a second question or observation would be that all of what you talked to us about today in this quarter report, when we were working on the budget last year, it's a dynamic process in the sense that it changes quite a bit. Very little was static. It was just there. That this changed as we were working it, both before and after Christmas, so that again the public can understand the processes that we went through to get what we got. That from your experience, and we also tried, I believe, to look for exceptions to policies if there was such a thing, but didn't and many states did that. My association with the National Council of State Legislators, I understood that a lot of states looked for exceptions to policies in order to take care of cities and towns, but we weren't allowed to do that. So I just want to, I think that you showed that, in this particular report, that some things were just designated for X. And even after we put the budget together, we will find out later that, well, you could make a slight change in something. So again, I just want the members of the panel to understand what, the challenges that we have going forward, and we obviously will do that. And then finally, you have sources, as you hear people say on television, I do too. But I don't know that the money that we get is going to be without strings attached to it this time too. So we're going to end up back in the same situation of trying to put a budget together with a lot of things that everyone needs. But it may or may not be there. And then finally, would you say that the size of our budget, which has been talked about on the news and in the papers, going from one number billion to another number billion, that a lot of that was due to the one-time kind of money that you're talking about, and but for COVID-19, our budget may or may not be 12 or 13 billion dollars. So just your take on that from.
Well, you raise a good point, Chairman. As I mentioned, a lot of the money that explains the increase from one year to the other is just flowing through the unemployment trust fund, thankfully via federal funds. Not every state treats their budget this way. And so sometimes when you compare Rhode Island with another small state, it's important to look at what they include in these numbers. Not every state includes tuition and fees for their public colleges. Not every state includes the flow of unemployment benefits. Some of them account for them outside this, consolidated budget. Rhode Island does it differently, and therefore sometimes those numbers appear very jarring. You don't have flexible use. You couldn't have used your neighbor's unemployment benefits to pave your neighbor's road. Those funds were really just, you are the custodian and they're flowing through you. You don't have control over, you can't spend them on anything you want.
Right, yeah, okay. Just trying to make those points, again, based upon your analysis of the second quarter, and we'll try to get a little bit more color from Jonathan if we can when it happens. Does anybody else have any questions of Sharon based upon what Rep. Maury, please? Sharon, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Sharon. So slide 25. I've seen a million slides in this room, and I've never seen complicated to operationalize in any of those slides. So when you say that we could end up spending more money if we were to spend this money, this might be unfair, but I think your whole job's unfair. So tell me, give me an example of how that could happen.
If you're looking at our share of state spending, so just think about it as it's relative, right? So if the budget decisions involve spending a lot more on other things, whatever it is, hiring a bunch of people, giving a lot of other local aid, but it does nothing different for education aid, just steady state, its share of the total goes down. You're going to be asked to hold a certain share so that decisions you make in every other part of the budget will influence this calculation. So where you used to just worry about, well, let me just make sure I'm spending what I spent before on a dollar amount, and that's easy math, right? But if we now have to say, okay, now we have to always look and see if the percent of the total is different, and every decision you make in another area now influences how much you have to spend on education aid in order to access a significant amount of money, it really makes the issue more multidimensional. And that's why I say it's complicated to operationalize, which is sort of a goofy phrase, but you know, even explaining it, how to do it, it'll be a challenge.
Okay, that makes me feel much better. Thank you, Sharon.
Good. Do you have a question?
Maybe.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sharon, I know before I make this question is unfair to you, but you're the expert in the room, and I want to take the opportunity of this. When you're talking about CRF, the COVID Release Fund, CRF, I'm thinking sometimes this is the Band-Aid that we put in the state until we go through this process, this difficult time. Now, under your experience to be the fiscal analysis of the Finance Committee in the state, on the House of Representatives, after we pass this difficult time, those rough water, do you see that the state can retake the role and move forward? Because I know we depend on a lot of the CRF funds right now to cover into like a bridge one thing to another one in order to continue. But I wanted to hear from your opinion. And again, it's unfair to asking that question when you don't have all the information you may need to make the analysis, but you will be the most qualified person to bring us to some kind of vision for the future of, is there any chance that the state of Rhode Island can retake the road again? Like, I feel like we are a truck, we are stuck in the road, and then we need to continue, but before that, we need to check the engine and everything of the truck in order to continue. Can you give me some hope or something, because I feel lost a lot of time?
That was a good question from Rep. Diaz. It really was. But if you can answer it in the context of what was here.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes.
I think,
yes.
Representative Diaz, you really bring up the thing I was trying to highlight in the presentation, and that is that a lot of the funding available to you to help you get past this period is limited, and so the choices you make about how to use it, how to invest in certain things, what long-term commitments you make with the money, or all of those things will affect your recovery. And so can you have a strong recovery? Absolutely. It's going to involve choices around policies and recognizing, really, if you keep in the forefront of your mind, how does this not just affect this year, but a few years down the road, I think, you'll be able to make some good decisions about, a stable recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Sharon.
As
Feel better
always.
too, like Amore.
Good. Representative Gero, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Sharon. It is very fluid, all of this funding, and I really appreciate all the work you and your staff does on this. I have a question regarding the $10 million with the community-based services for the intellectually developmental disability community. You mentioned the CRF funding obviously is one-time only. So what's going to happen, when that goes away? What is the state's commitment? I mean, this is a federal consent decree, right? And I would think compliance is not optional.
Well, a couple of things. One thing to remember is, like other providers, this network was affected by the shutdowns associated. So folks who would ordinarily have gone to day programs were not going there, and therefore they did not receive reimbursement for that service. So some of this issue is truly linked to that disruption. And so those funds, and I think a budget can probably speak to this a little bit better than me, but those funds are meant to sort of help smooth that over. In addition to a number of other measures the state took, by the way, on helping providers through the last several months. What you're talking about is, how does the state look at the system moving forward,
Right.
In the context of the consent decree, which deals with the day and community and work programs, and ensure that it can keep compliance with that consent decree. That's a work in progress. I think the committee will be asked to weigh in on funding plans. it's definitely, like everything else, a work in progress.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Does anybody else have any questions for, Rep. Quattrochi, welcome back.
Thank you, Chairman. Hi, Sharon. Nice to see you. I guess I have a concern that I think needs to be said, and it may not deal so much with the current budget, but I think that it certainly will impact future budgets. So we're looking at getting $117 million for transportation, correct, out of the Consolidated Appropriations Act in total. And my concern is that the voters aren't getting the proper information when going to the polls. And in fact, they're already early voting has already begun since the 10th, and they don't have this information, and they're going in being asked to okay 72 million more in a bond, and that's my concern. And I know it's not really a question, but I think it was a concern that needed to be said and heard. So, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I love it when he does that. It's always pertinent. It really is. I appreciate that because people need to know that their concerns are brought to us, and so I appreciate that. Sharon, did you want to make a comment on that before?
Yeah, I mean, it is a new piece to the puzzle. I think just for a little bit of context, the money that's going before the voters on the ballot was not intended to cover all of the potential match opportunities. It was really just a piece of what DOT had been seeking. You may recall that the Assembly did not act on a borrowing of something like $60 million that was proposed. So there's probably a difference of opinion or differing levels of funding that people would be expecting in total. And this the federal funds may bring them close to what they were hoping for, but as you say, it was not known at the time that ballot item was developed.
And it's important to know that it's a lot of what Rep. Diaz was asking in her questions. When you don't know something and you have to make a decision on it, it makes it that much more difficult. But at the same time, a lot is unknown right now as we go forward. So it's going to be our job to try to figure out how to meander through that maze as we look for and have to vote on bills that cost money. It's a moving target for the next year or so. So it's our job to make sure we stay as straight as possible.
If I could, Chairman?
Yes.
One more concern, and hopefully as the departments come before us, we can have some of these questions answered, was about unemployment, because the majority of the money we've received is for unemployment, correct? And I don't know about everybody else, but not only personally people I know, but many of my constituents have contacted me with fraud cases. And it's been a big problem in the state, and hopefully we can find out what kind of numbers are attached to that. So that's it.
I agree.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Speaking of which, Jonathan, are you there? Oh, okay, thank you very much. You've heard so far what Sharon has presented, and now we're looking for you, if you can put a little color to that. I don't have a specific question for you myself, some of the others may, but if you'd like to make a comment or two about the report, this would be a great time to do it and enlighten us.
So thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Glad to see some familiar faces again. Happy to comment on this. I also have with me my colleague, Dan Orgel, in case there's a piece that I can't answer. So, as the House Fiscal Advisor said, we're in a very uncertain environment, and we're all looking at moments in time when guidance and information are constantly changing. The quarterly report was a point in time. I'd certainly agree with the analysis that since then, and we've gotten a better sense of the guidance from the federal government regarding FEMA. In particular, You might see in the press that we were able to draw down over $60 million directly from FEMA to help with vaccine. That isn't really new money per se. They're allowing states to draw down money ahead of time for the first time. Usually they make us only work on a reimbursement basis, so it's fairly uncertain about what they'll fully reimburse for, but this is one of the first times they've ever done a pre-authorization and let us draw down money. So it's not money that we weren't expecting, but the fact that we get it ahead of time is certainly beneficial. In addition, with that FEMA change and with the federal Medicaid match change, we are expecting some relief, more relief in FY21 that we'll be able to present in the governor's budget that can probably help balance FY22. On the other hand, the Paycheck Protection Program tax changes in December are a very, very large hit to the revenue, probably over $100 million, maybe less than 150, but over 100. We're still working through some of that, but that will offset a lot of the gains that the Biden administration has announced in the short term, and certainly, the possibility of additional federal aid is very welcome. But just to make one point, they're even looking at changing the maintenance of effort rules on the December money. So you can just sort of see the loop that we're in and trying to make decisions right now. So even once that bill passes out of Congress, it's likely going to be weeks, or as you can tell from the December stimulus, months before we have a clear idea of exactly what those federal funds can be used for. With that, Chairman, I'm certainly happy to take questions and answer them to the best of my ability.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I would like to say that we work in really good partnership with the executive branch, and you and your staff bring a lot to the conversations when we're having this. So we have not been together as we normally do, but I'm glad to see we're back, and we've got a lot of issues to solve, and we couldn't do it without the expertise that you and your staff has as well as ours on this side. Does anybody have any questions of Jonathan at this point? Every time that we have a briefing, we will have someone generally from the administration that may be able to answer a question. And there may not be a lot of questions at this point because we just, got this to a degree, but we just always make sure that you have a chance to say hello to Jonathan in a great way. Chairwoman Gero, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And Jonathan, thank you. It's nice to see you again. I kind of would like to tease out something that my colleague, Rep. Quattrochi, started with, and that is the unemployment. And I want to just make a shout out. Matt Weldon, who's now the new director over at DLT, has been phenomenally helpful for me with many, many of my constituents, and I'm sure to a lot of my colleagues as well. But I'm getting calls, as many of us are, on people now getting 1099 forms on unemployment in their name that they never filed for. Could you just share with me what is being done, and how did we not anticipate this kind of a breach? And I know we're not the only state. And do you know how many millions of fraudulent unemployment claims there are out there?
Representative, it's great to see you, especially you today. So welcome back. This is a particular personal problem, as well as a state problem for me. So I am very, very attuned to the problem you're describing. It has been a problem in many states, not just ours, and it certainly appears that a large portion of that has to do with credentials that have been, sold on the web, that have been obtained through data breaches and other environments, and then used to follow the to put in for these claims. And usually it requires a social security number. So this isn't just, some, random name and random address that, can be found. It requires real information that is difficult to obtain. But apparently there's enough of that out there that it is certainly causing a large problem. The investigation is ongoing. The state police working with the FBI are working diligently on this issue. And certainly, this is an issue that is costing the federal government and indirectly the state, millions and millions of dollars. If it's a subject that you're very interested in, I'd suggest that the committee maybe try to get a briefing, from the state police about the investigation. Or UI directly, but it is certainly a large problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
You are quite welcome. Are there any other questions from any of the members on the panel at this point? Okay, if not, Jonathan, thank you and your staff so much, and Sharon, as usual, thank you and your staff for the great job that you do, and then thank all of the members who are being brought up to date on the issues that we need to address in the future. But if there are no other further questions, and that should end the business of the Finance Committee tonight, thank you all for participating.